Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and today we're going to complete our last exploration on Tartaria as a whole. In the past, we've looked at the greater glories of Tartaria. We've explored what it may have looked like, and these are just theories because the reality is we have no idea exactly what it looked like. But we have a good idea of what it may have looked like based on the remaining architectural examples that we have that endured to our own civilization in the 5th era. And yet, for whatever reason, the civilization of the 4th era, what we call Tartaria on this channel, is a civilization that we find very alluring. We also find that many of the greatest achievements in humanity and its history seem to be reflected in Tartaria, and the actual intention behind this civilization, which was to achieve balance within the individual, but also to achieve balance between the individual, the cities, and nature. It's certainly something that we can see in our current civilization that we tend not to have balance. At least not a balance that we can recognize. We oftentimes see ourselves being moved to polar opposites on any and every issue, whether it's the differences in our ideology or our appearances or even our economic systems. And as a result of our deference to this type of conflict, we see our civilization in ruins. We see the ruins of the previous civilization of Tartaria. We know that it was a great civilization that had achieved wondrous heights, a unity of purpose within humanity. But how exactly did it fall? In the past, we posited who was truly responsible, and we came to a little bit of a conclusion that perhaps we were responsible, or at least our progenitors were responsible. Yet, looking deeper into the history of Tartaria, I think we can still see the very forces and their effects in our current civilization that caused the fall of the previous civilization. If you think about what every civilization aspires to be and do, it's to grow and to increase in size and knowledge. And while the people of Tartaria looked within themselves, they sought more lands to explore. There are accounts in this that they opened portals to other lands, that they attempted to access areas that they didn't have access to. In effect, they had reached the physical boundaries of their realm or their lands, and they sought to explore others. It was in this exploration, though, that they opened a portal to a dark land, and they allowed some other dark beings to reach their land through this portal. By the time that they had realized what they had opened up, they found themselves facing an entity with a power that they couldn't even begin to imagine. An entity that seemed to reflect some sort of anti-deity, or an anti-god, if you will. This anti-god quickly filled the land and turned the people of Tartaria against themselves. But how was this achieved? What happened that caused the great civilization that was unified in purpose, that had achieved balance, to completely fall apart and ultimately be destroyed? We can still see the remnants of Tartaria everywhere we look across the lands. Castles, ruins, some buildings that are kept in better shape than others, and even older remnants of the buildings of previous eras. When we look at our 5 eras theory, we start with our contemporary era because that's where we are now. And we examine all of the aspects of our contemporary era. People will tell you that some things don't apply to Tartaria and some things do, but the reality is everything does. Because we are descended. We are the progeny of the civilizations that came before us. It doesn't matter if there were 4 resets, 5 resets, or 2,000 resets. We are still the same people. It's safe to say that there have been vast changes within both ourselves and our civilization and the society. When we look at the 4th era, the Tartarian civilization, we examine their great triumph. But now we're going to look at the decline and fall. How did this great civilization erode and disintegrate, ultimately turn upon itself, and then found itself isolated and destroyed by the forces that it had exposed itself to in its attempts to explore new lands, to access other lands? And we can see the great tragedy of the destruction of the once great examples of architecture. And we can see the remnants of it, even perhaps in some of the images that we have that perhaps were not altered from the 19th century. The height of the 4th era, or the Tartarian civilization, is something that we believe dreams are composed of. It's very difficult to properly imagine or visualize exactly what these images were in this civilization. The finest examples of architecture and society working together, people achieving balance, looking inward for internal strength, and most importantly, possessing self-discipline. What we know as our paradigm in our current civilization is that we have external discipline. In other words, external institutions, individuals enforce discipline upon us. We do not seek to be self-disciplined. We tend to be discouraged from seeking self-discipline. And what this leads to is when you rely on another force, authority, or individual to impose discipline upon you, it means that that entity is ultimately dictating how you're going to live your life. They're going to tell you what's important, and they're going to do it in the most insidious ways possible. Even though you may be consciously aware of it, even though you may see it, and you write about it and you lament about it every day of your life, you're oftentimes willing to accept it because you've been conditioned to accept it. You've been conditioned that there can be nothing better in the past, or that in the past everything just fell apart because the previous civilization was corrupt. And indeed, a lot of what we're allowed to or encouraged to explore when it comes to a previous civilization was the ways in which it was corrupt. Because you'll see that the corruption is reflected in our current civilization, and even in our supposed recorded mainstream account, you will find the examples of corruption. Yet contrast that with what we see as the dream of Tartaria, or the Fourth Era civilization. And that dream is a people who had self-discipline, who had self-restraint, and yet at the same time achieved balance. They were able to overcome their physical differences and all the other differences and live in a state of balance. Now, of course, this has to be mocked, this has to be derided, because this is a threat to the current power structure that we have in our Fifth Era civilization. No one is supposed to know that they have greater capabilities as an individual, that they have spiritual strength which cannot be matched in any way, shape, or form. Yet looking at the examples that we have of the Fourth Civilization, with the great achievements in architecture, we'll be told that somebody else had to do this. It was a divine being, or it was some form of artificial intelligence, which nowadays seems to be a substitute for a divine being for many. And if that's what you choose to believe, then so be it. But we have to remember that many of the greatest works of art that depict the wonders of the past came from a human being. It came from a human's creative inspiration. The tales of fantasy did not come from some artificial intelligence. They came from human creativity, the spirituality within every single human being that no doubt comes from some sort of divine power. And while I may not have spoken of it directly in the past in the channel, I've certainly alluded to it. And the reality is, our search for understanding and who we are comes from within. It does not come without. And ultimately, that was the great mistake. That was the mistake that was made in the past that led to the eventual destruction and downfall of Tartaria. When you look at all the myths and all the examples of what may have been in the past, even that does not match the grandeur for what was in reality. Because we can look across the lands and we can see great examples of horrific destruction in Siberia, in the northeastern portion of Siberia. And we'll have a designated historical account that'll tell us what was there, and will tell us about the great kingdoms that were there. But I don't believe that at the height of its civilization that a person, a citizen of Tartaria, the civilization, or whatever it was actually called, because remember that we just use that name as a placeholder because we don't know what language they spoke. We don't know what exactly they called their civilization or how they divided their lands, and perhaps they didn't divide their lands at all. They didn't believe in such a concept. It's always interesting when you look at the concepts of certain cultures that we're told believed in boundaries on land, but then conversely we're told that they did not believe in the boundaries of land, that land had now boundaries, that land was for everyone. Now you might be arguing, well, how could anybody live in such a system where there's no division? Well, somehow we manage to live in cities now where there's no actual division, although we believe there's a division of ownership. Is it real, or is it just what we accept? These are all questions that we have to explore. We also look at the concept of Camelot and King Arthur and the legend of Excalibur. I believe that that particular myth alludes to what was very likely the last legitimate regime of Tartaria, or the civilization that preceded ours. It was not based upon one person's vanity, or one person acting as king. Yes, there was King Arthur, but King Arthur didn't see himself as some sort of divine monarch. What he ultimately saw himself as was a person who worked for the betterment of the entire civilization. That was indeed the very crux of the idea of the Round Table. That everyone was equal, no one was above any other, and that the role of being the leader was simply a function. It was not some sort of near divine being that was to be worshipped. Ultimately, Arthur sacrificed himself for what was and the dream of what could be. And it's those very words that we have to remember. Things were once very great in the past, and they could be very great in the future. The way things were subverted was by kings and titles. Once the entity that managed to infiltrate Tartarian civilization, or the Fourth Era civilization, grabbed hold, one of the first things it seemed to do was to subvert individuals. And where that started was many individuals taking the title of king. How much do we value the title of king? How much do you see the use of king this and king that? King Charles, King Henry, King Charles the Simple, King Charlemagne. It goes on and on. Although Charlemagne had himself declared emperor, it doesn't really matter because what you have is this obsession almost with titles. Now, before anybody says that I'm degrading anybody who puts value in titles, that's not what I'm saying at all. But what I'm saying is that when you embrace the importance of titles, you have to be cautious because before you know it, you are suddenly putting the certification of a larger group on your own self-value. In other words, the titles that endure to this day. I remember there was a political science teacher during his class who was explaining to his students that we don't use titles in the United States anymore. For example, you would call me Lord Schmidt if we still use titles. And then one of the students quite accurately quipped, "Ah yes, but we still have to call you Dr. Schmidt." Everybody got a good chuckle out of that, including myself. But what it says, though, is that if you value titles over your own individual value, then you're letting someone else dictate what your value is. And that is not what life is about. We dictate our own value. And no matter how many people try to tell you fallacies, how many people try to convince you that they're doing the right thing, or whoever dresses up in kingly robes with their wonderful adornments and decorations, there really is no difference between one human being or another. And one of the other things that caused the Fourth Era civilization to fall apart was not just the embracing of titles and indulgence and self-vanity. It was also the change in identity. What we saw was suddenly a more increased political division, a geographical division within the lands, dividing up the lands into many different principalities, and suddenly changing the ways in which they were facilitated, and even embracing the concept of being governed. If you have a people who are self-disciplined, what need is there for governance? But if you have a people who are not self-disciplined and have to be disciplined by an external force, then you have every great need for governance, which involves individuals taking the titles of king and dressing up in all the pageantry that you can imagine, with flowing robes and very nice tights. And we have room for queens too, or it doesn't really matter. Anybody can call themselves a king. It doesn't matter what your gender or your background is, or it's interesting how it even transcends cultures, that pretty much anybody can be declared a king for any point in time, or an emperor. And indeed, many of the symbols of this endure to this day. So what you have that's been effectively undermined, and what was no doubt effectively undermined in the Fourth Era civilization, was the concept of leadership. Instead of a leader seeing themselves as a servant of the people, they looked to themselves as divine beings. The defense forces of Tartaria were subverted as well. Now, I've long had an exploration looking into the military orders that we have of the medieval period, and not just focused on Europe, but all the other military orders across the lands. Yet, we can see a great example in the military orders that we believe are associated with Europe, even though they operated extensively in what is today the Middle East, such as the Knights Templar, the Teutonic Knights, the Knights Hospitaller. all the other military orders that we have. The one that tends to get the most attention, though, is the Knights Templar. What we're told about the Knights Templar in our official history is that they were a military order that was founded for the Crusades, for the European or the Latin nations, as they were called at that time, to recapture the Holy Land for Christendom. And in their foundation, though, we seem to have views of chastity, views of poverty, and that they were specifically dedicated to their mission. But the Knights Templar, unfortunately, according to the official account, decided to embrace the concept of wealth, and that they were, in effect, one of the early banking systems, at least according to the official history, that presided over Europe, and as a result of which they were targeted and destroyed by the monarch of France, again according to the official history. And yet, if we look at how they operated, the Knights Templar, if they had stayed true to their original vows, what was closer? What was closer to the original concept of the once great military that defended Tartaria or the Fourth Era civilization? I believe it was the original vows and concepts of chivalry. And I've noticed that when you study this, when you study the official historical account of medieval history, you'll be told that knights only applied chivalry to noble ladies and nobility. They didn't apply it to anybody else. But what if it did apply to everyone? What if the reality was the concept of chivalry, the concept of humility, of actually embracing and defending others, did universally apply to everyone? How much does that change these military orders in our eyes, if that's what they were truly about? And over time they became subverted. Much in the same way that the leaders of Tartaria were subverted, these knights became subverted and suddenly began to embrace the importance of material possessions, and not just money, but even the idea of money. Strangely enough, the very same things that we contend with every day. Now, I'm not saying that the concept of material possessions in and of themselves are bad. Like everything else, it's how we deal with things. If we allow ourselves to be consumed by anything, whether it's material possessions, love, or anything, it can cause us to do things that we would not do otherwise. Because suddenly we start to value the idea of this over our own self-discipline. We lose our self-identity. And if you look at the things that we contend with every day, it seems as though everything is directed towards keeping us from understanding our true selves. And this is very true when we look at the official historical account of the Knights Templar. This is a military order that had a very noble purpose and seemed to have a very noble method, a methodology behind how they lived true to that noble purpose and those values. Indeed, the Knights Templars are viciously derided as evil, or the antagonists, in the novel Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. You might remember we looked at the Scott Monument when we did our exploration in Scotland. It's a very striking monument that supposedly depicts characters. This is the original depiction of the Knights Templar. Two knights riding one horse, and the reason being because they were impoverished. That was one of their essential vows. Very similar to the Franciscan monastic order in Christianity, that they embraced poverty. And yet there is a conflicting account that says that these Knights Templar devolved into concepts of violence, and they believed in violence and engaging in acts of violence, and that became more important to them, in addition to their valuing the idea of money above all else. And you can find a similar account with the Teutonic Knights, who supposedly took in the remnants of the Knights Templar and then continued their so-called colonization efforts into what is today Prussia. It's very interesting, and this is all the official historical account. Yet, again, there are conflicting accounts that say that these military orders once had a more noble purpose, that knights truly did live true to the concept of chivalry, and that it didn't just apply to a select few in the population, but it applied equally to everyone. So what's reality and what's merely the blended fiction? It's hard to say. And that's all by design. We're not supposed to have a clear account of the civilization that preceded us. Indeed, you're encouraged, and it's quite okay to talk about the Knights Templar once they had devolved. There's an interesting episode of Robin of Sherwood, yes, that show again, that I think tells the entire story of the Knights Templar in one single episode. It's called 7 Poor Knights from Acre. And in that story, Robin Hood and his band of outlaws come across a group of Knights Templar, 7 knights, who had a small object, a gold object that was a depiction of the Order of the Knights Templar stolen from them by this individual. As a result of this, the Knights Templar seek to find the individual responsible, kill him, and then reacquire their material item that supposedly means everything to their honor. And in the process of doing so, they kill many innocent people trying to retrieve this object, and they even kill a member of Robin's band. And Robin himself has to actually engage in hand-to-hand combat, single combat with one of the knights to try to save one of the other members of his band. It's a very well-written story, and it's very interesting how within an hour they managed to summarize the exact progress of the Knights Templar. How they went from being a monastic order that was dedicated to the defense of a society to an order that was self-serving. Supposedly it was about their honor, but the reality is it was about the material item that had monetary value. That's why they went on this little quest near Nottingham, and why they killed innocent people, and why they attempted to terrorize Robin Hood and the outlaws. They even ran afoul of the sheriff and Guy of Gisborne, although the sheriff, acting on his own opportunistic notions, tells Guy to stand down and allow the Knights Templar to hunt Robin and the band of outlaws. Because why do it when they could have someone else do it for them? In the end, Robin Hood prevails, and I didn't understand it at first, but I do now. The knights are stripped of the armor, and then they're sent off on one horse. And you can see that the 2 knights here, without their armor, do actually reflect what's supposed to be the ideal concept for the Knights Templar. 2 knights riding on one horse. I'd missed that when I initially viewed the episode, but upon rewatch for this exploration, I saw the truth in that. And that's what it reflects. It doesn't just reflect that truth for military orders, leaders, or monastic orders. Consider that Tartaria was carved into successor states, ruled by kings. And these are the aspects of Tartaria we're supposed to talk about. And you'll find 3 greater Tartaries or Tartarias all over the map in many different locations. We also have the accounts of madness that gripped the previous civilization. And there's no doubt that there were some people who tried to live true to the values of self-discipline, and they ran afoul of the compromised leaders and military orders, some of which who still acted in accordance with the rules of the old civilization, and others that didn't. And this is likely why we have these accounts of all these strange sicknesses, such as the dancing plague and many other bizarre accounts from our supposed incorruptible mainstream historical account. But I do think there's a lot of truth to this. There is a lot of truth into the history that we are able to see. But what seems to be the consistent reality is that we're only supposed to see the previous civilization as being a failure. We're supposed to question ourselves, and we're supposed to feel helpless, and the last thing we're ever supposed to develop is a sense of self-discipline, a sense of the ability of exploring ourselves and finding our own spiritual strength from within. You need to rely on other institutions. You need to have other people tell you what to do. When you look at how the lands were carved up and divided politically, you notice that as maps become newer, these political boundaries become more prevalent. They're a lot easier to see. Why is that? Why is it on older maps it seems as though there are no true political boundaries? Why do these accounts of mass insanity and hysteria seem to increase in certain times? What makes more sense? Was there really just all these isolated incidences of mass panic going on? Or was it really a population that was trying to struggle to find itself, to understand why their entire civilization was collapsing, why the leaders that they had trusted had suddenly turned against them, and were constantly keeping them turned against one another? Why was the great defense force that they had once relied on suddenly turning to materialism and not living true to the values that they always had? It had to be a very frightening experience for them, and no doubt many did try to find their way back to their own self-internal images, and yet at the same time, they found the people that they had relied on turning against them. And it's safe to say that this mentality, this primary method of operation, continues to this day. It is very easy to keep people turned against one another, and you can find any variety of reasons to turn people against one another. And I have no doubt that even in the grand heritage of the previous civilization, that some groups were told that they were more responsible for the achievements than other groups. It's another way. It's more of a positive way that you can turn people against one another. You can say that some people are more responsible for others for achievements than others. You can then say that those people who are not more responsible are the outcasts from society. They're people who shouldn't be listened to. You can use any number of means to reinforce this. You can use financial incentives, you can use patronage, and you'll see it every day. And no doubt this has been with us longer than we can begin to imagine. That is how the previous civilization ultimately collapsed. How it broke down into successor states, corrupted by the very forces of evil, corrupted from the inside and the outside, disintegrating and eroding, until finally it became vulnerable. Vulnerable by the very forces that it had unfortunately encountered. In its exploration for more land to explore, they unleashed a great evil. An evil that destroyed them from the inside. And there's no doubt that there are concepts of this evil that remain with us to this day. And you don't have to look very far or very hard to see examples of it. Can it be overcome? Well, the reality is, it's still unchanged from when King Arthur said it. Defend what was and the dream of what could be. There is still a very powerful dream of what could be. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Welcome and thank you for joining me for today's theory video into the fall of Tartaria. I thought it was important to look at how Tartaria could have fallen. We've talked about it before and after the reset. We've never really looked though at what the civilization looked like aside from a few vision photos. Today though, I want to consider the theories for how it fell. But to start off, I want to share the approach of the channel. The channel seeks to explore these theories to prove or disprove them. Always maintain objectivity, the hardest part. Reveal and share details of the land with all viewers. Encourage you to seek your own answers, and keep asking questions and we will find the truth. Let's go back to the 5 eras theory, which is what we're looking at. And today we're going to be focusing exclusively on the Tartarian Age, or the civilization that preceded ours, in the 4th era. Recall that it's surrounded by the Golden Age, which we believe consisted of 3 eras, or at least the channel has theorized that, and then followed by our current contemporary age, also derisively called the Plastic Age, the Disposable Age by other researchers, which I certainly agree with. We don't know how long the Tartarian Age truly lasted. It could have been a few hundred years, it could have been a few thousand years, it could have been over 10,000 years. What we know is they had incredible accomplishments in architecture, society, and civilization. And oftentimes we're derided for even suggesting such theories because we are told and reassured that our civilization is the pinnacle of humanity. Yet we see so much evidence that contradicts that when we look at images of what Tartaria could have looked like. And yes, I'll admit Tartaria is a term that we use to refer to the civilization before us. It has many different names. We're expected to believe that there was a civilization called Rome that lasted 1,000 years despite being very corrupt and despite every significant leader in that civilization betraying the other leader. Yet when we look at this civilization of Tartaria, our imaginations are inspired, our hearts are lifted, because in every depiction of it we see a society that managed to work together and achieve balance in a way that we really can't imagine. And when we say achieving balance, what do we mean? Is that just a plug line? Is that just a saying? No. What we see is a civilization that achieved balance between the society and the individual. There was a great society, and yet at the same time, it did care and nurture for the individual. That is the true balance that we see. And this is how you can explain different civilizations, different cultures with different languages working together and achieving a common civilization, because there was a mutual understanding between the goods of society and the good of the individual. There was always something given and something returned on both sides. And we look at what their achievements were and could have been, and we see the remnants of it even today in our own civilization. And that's why we ask these questions. This is something that inspires us just to think about their achievements, and how far their society and their civilization really could have gone. It's not just architecture, though. There are still remnants of this everywhere within our own civilization. Many people struggle to accept this, and they will certainly deny it and deride it in any way that they can. Yet, if your eyes are open, you'll see that so much of it remains. Just imagine living in that kind of civilization, one that really cared for the individual as much as the individual cared for society. That was the true balance. We have to wonder if the story or myth of the Tower of Babel was not simply about the languages being confused. Perhaps it was really about the understanding between people and the balance being confused. And that was where the real breakdown started. In this video, we're seeking to explain who or what was responsible for the fall of this incredible civilization. And this is something that compels us in all this research. This video is based on theory and conjecture because ultimately none of us know. The records are lost. We don't have something of an account that we can truly rely on. We have to go off of our research. We have to compare and contrast all the clues that we find. And there are still many clues that you can go out and interact with today physically. There are accounts in the myth, and then of course examining the historical accounts that were given. There's also a bit of a blending between what's real, what may be considered fantasy, and what you can still go interact with, such as the Great Water Tower column that still exists in St. Louis today, in the middle. And yet you compare and contrast those with a fantasy rendering on the left, and then what's supposed to be a concept architectural rendering on the right. Yet for some reason all this feels real. All of this seems like it's something that could have existed and could have been a part of our actual history. And once again, people will deny this and say, well, it's just a water tower. There's nothing special about it. So what if it's over 150 feet tall? Yet we look at other conceptualized drawings in our imagination where we see large hangars and incredible technology, inspired by what's called steampunk. Yet somehow it feels so familiar to us, as though this is something that truly existed in our own history. It doesn't seem like it's that disconnected. We also see the incredible hangars and the remarkable buildings that could have contained such devices. We also have so much imagination for the different methods of travel that could have been used and connected such a civilization. Travel on the ground, travel in the air, travel below ground, with many different means, whether it was airships or other aspects that we can't even imagine. Some of these structures clearly still remain, with all the Union stations and their tall ceilings and all their incredible hardened construction on the inside with materials we can't imagine. Yet we have to accept the fact that the civilization is no longer with us, that it was lost. But why was it lost? This video, we're not seeking to point the finger at any particular group of people, because the theories that we're going to propose involve what happened with the previous civilization. And I believe that we do far too much of trying to blame one particular group of people for why we're in the situation we're in. We're going to look at three options, and the first one is we made it happen. The corruption that is inherent within human beings, and many of the myth stories that we have say that we grew too arrogant in our abilities. It's possible this same aspect could have struck the previous civilization. They attempted to do something using their science or their balance of science with nature to go even further in their capabilities. And in the prospect of doing so, they created a great disaster. Was this disaster some combination of natural and artificial forces that brought about some sort of plasma rain that destroyed the entire civilization? We have many accounts of what appear to be meteorites, although we know they could have many different explanations, striking cities, whether it's Sodom and Gomorrah or whether it's the Peshtigo fire that may have had something to do with what happened to Chicago. We just don't know. We don't know exactly where these events happened in history, and yet at the same time, there are far too many accounts of this to truly ignore. There are far too many images of this to ignore. So we go back to the explanation that it was simply us. Our pride grew with our ability. We saw what a great civilization that we could build. We saw our achievements, and we wanted to see how far we could actually take it. Then we also consider the other stories that we have of a great deluge or a massive flood. Now we'll be told that this flood was caused by some deity, and it may well have been. Yet there's other accounts that say that a deluge may have destroyed a civilization, such as the legend of Atlantis, because, again, it grew corrupt in the fact that all they pursued were their abilities and wanting to expand their abilities beyond what they knew were their limits. And as a result of that, it caused the destruction of their civilization in a way that they weren't able to recover from. And this doesn't just appear from myth, but we also see this reflected in fiction, science fiction, and fantasy today. Think of the stories of old Valyria from the Song of Ice and Fire and how it was destroyed. It was all from the same cause, because the people and the civilization grew corrupt internally, and they sought to expand themselves beyond their natural bounds, and they paid a heavy price for it. Then there's also the concept of conflict, and perhaps the previous civilization simply broke down. The once great threads that were so strong that held that civilization together fell apart. They had achieved too much, and as we always see reflected in our current civilization, there was one group that felt that it was more important than another group and exploited whatever minor or major differences. Ultimately, if we think about it, there are very few differences between human beings. And yet at the same time, those same differences could have been exploited in the past for those seeking power. It is again a recurring theme and a recurring story that we have to face. It's not perhaps the most inspiring of stories, but it is true that this could have been how Tartaria fell, that the civilization had reached its ascendant over hundreds or even thousands of years, and finally it began to fall apart, because they had expanded themselves too far, or they had simply been around to the point where some people believe they could have more. Theory 2, we were corrupted to make it happen. We have many allusions to the fact that there are corruptions within human beings that could have happened from some external force that we can't fully understand. There's a lot of evidence for this in the fact that in our myth and even to contemporary times, we see that the greatest battle seems to be for a person's soul. And it's not just a plug line. There's so much effort that's put into influencing people what to do, what to think, and what to believe, as though we wish to deny people their true individuality and give them an individuality through some other sort of belief set. We have to wonder if this isn't something that's imposed by some sort of external force that we don't fully understand. Because it always seems that in myth and even in fantasy and other accounts, the greatest stories of the greatest civilizations always fall because they become internally corrupted or decadent. Now, this varies from the first theory, and the first theory that we just believe that this is completely internal and this is just human nature. Whereas the second theory indicates that this is some sort of external force that somehow manages to exploit the natural aspects of human existence and ultimately turn human beings against one another. We have other images where we see once corrupted human beings begin to fight each other and they begin to destroy their civilization. They believe that they are acting in the name of righteousness, they are righting past wrongs, or they are simply acting in the name of their survival. And yet every time we have so many stories, and it's such a repeated and recurring story, where we see the people more than willing to inflict horrific acts against one another, all in the name of righteousness. We see that buildings are destroyed, and much, much worse, so many people are killed, all because others are told that it needed to happen. It was necessary. And how many people ever stop and simply ask a simple question as to why they are told to do such actions? Oftentimes we look at the vast levels of indoctrination. And yet in these images we see what can happen when people are motivated to this extent. We see the great human spirit suddenly applied to something very malevolent, and done so without any hesitation, time and time again. We also see this depicted so many times in movies, plots, stories, novels, in our myth. It's all over the place. Until finally, the civilization reaches a point to where it's so corrupted that the internal and the external forms of human beings no longer resemble human beings. They resemble some sort of creature. Now, is this really a physical representation of what happened, or is this just simply an interpretation of people corrupting themselves, that this is what they would look like if you were able to see how they were corrupted? We don't see human beings anymore. We see ghastly apparitions, all over the land. And we see the fact that there's no limits to what they're willing to do. They are completely and totally overwhelmed and controlled by their simple desire to survive and to consume anything and everything that is around them. And it's a story that's repeated so many times. And here we see the final transformation of human beings into these horrific creatures. There's many different names for them: demons, dark angels, horrific apparitions that we can't even begin to imagine. Yet it appears in every single society. It appears in every single myth that this can happen to human beings to where they can become corrupted. You'll see slight variations in what the names are for these creatures or the processes by which this happens. And yet when we step far enough back and we look at this in totality, we see that this is the exact same story, repeated time and time again. And I believe there's a lot of strong evidence for this theory, that there are forces that seek to corrupt us, both as individuals, as groups, and overall as a society. And then finally, the third theory: Tartaria was destroyed by an external force. There are many different accounts from both myth, legend, and fiction where we have some sort of dark, malevolent entity that comes from the outside and that it wishes to impose its will on humanity. We see this reflected perhaps in the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's world, where we see the original Valar, one of the great deities, who had been corrupted and sought to corrupt the natural order of the world, and dedicated his entire existence to corrupting the world. It's very possible that our lands in the distant past could have been subjected to such an external force that sought to destroy the existing civilization. It is possible that that's what could have been inflicted on the previous civilization of Tartaria, that some sort of external force accessing the lands, whether it was through some sort of portal, some sort of interdimensional nexus where there was travel between dimensions or other lands. It sounds far-fetched, and yet at the same time we have so many different indications through many different perspectives that indicate that this is indeed possible. And it does give credibility to the fact that there could have been some sort of external force that attacked the previous civilization, targeting its cities and attempting to overcome it through an external existential battle, utilizing forces and means which we can't possibly understand, given the level of destruction that we see across the lands. Or perhaps it's some combination of these three theories. Perhaps all aspects play a significant part in what caused the fall of Tartaria. There was internal corruption that was inherent because the civilization had been around so long. There was an external force that attempted to attack it physically, but was defeated by the strength of the civilization. So the external force changed its approach. It changed its approach to corrupt the people from within. And we have to ask the question, does that corruption still exist to this day? Is it really the fact that human beings are born to be something inspiring, to achieve great things? Yet time and time again we see how they are corrupted by the purposes of others. And perhaps there's some malevolent entity that we can't fully understand. My theory comes from Neverwhere Land. There's a segment in the 1981 Canadian animated film called Heavy Metal, and this segment was called Neverwhere Land. It's a segment that did not appear in the final film. But just to summarize, this is one of the most disturbing segments you'll ever see, and I'll put the link in the description of the video. In Neverwhere Land, we see the malevolent entity called the Loknar, an entity that doesn't belong on the land that suddenly arrives. It influences and corrupts all the life forms in the land to destroy each other. And in a segment that only lasts 3 minutes and 30 seconds, and even though the animation isn't complete, you get a very dark, unsettling, and terrific feeling that overcomes you whenever you watch this segment. It's very difficult to watch, and I believe the reason that it is difficult to watch is because it accurately depicts what truly can happen to human beings time and time again when they become corrupted internally, when they suddenly find themselves willing to do horrific acts, all in the name of doing righteousness. And I will warn you, this is a very upsetting segment to watch, and it's very difficult. But it does accurately depict what can happen And we certainly have so many examples within whatever history you happen to believe of events like this occurring. And that's probably why it's so upsetting and disturbing to watch, because we can't deny that what we're seeing in this 3-minute animated segment that wasn't even complete, that causes us to feel self-reflection, realizing what we could be truly capable of. We have the ability for greatness. But that's why it's so important that we ask questions and we understand ourselves. That's why I believe it is important that we're willing to explore ourselves and willing to face all the challenges of life, whatever the reality of existence is, with our own perspectives intact. Not unduly influenced by the forces of others, whether it's some malevolent entity or it's something that's simply trying to twist us to serve its own purposes. It's most important that we know who we are, and that's where I find we have the greatest hope for the future.
Now once more I must ride with my knights to defend what was and the dream of what could be.
Welcome, and one of the recurring themes of exploration on this channel is the concept of a capital of Tartaria, or the civilization that came before ours. We find that a capital city has an alluring centralization concept to it that we often find in all of our current nation states that are marked by tremendous landmarks and unbelievable architecture, both Old World and New World. Was it really a capital city, or was it really just a capital, a single structure? We're not really sure, but in this exploration we're going to examine what a lost capital of Tartaria may have appeared like, and why is it so alluring to us. We're also going to discuss our future explorations in trying to locate the remnants of a potential capital of Tartaria. We see this incredible layout of this very beautiful city with this immense structure that we could assume is a capital with an O, or what we describe as a single structure that represents the capital within a capital city with an A. And of course we're having fun with the English language again, because the English language is always very much interesting and enjoyable to have fun with. And everywhere we look, we see that while this may be a depiction that is fictitious, it still shows many elements of realism to it. And it should be noted that every single structure that you see in this image, something like it exists across the land. Now imagine if all these tremendous old world structures that we've examined in all these recent explorations were located in a single city, indeed a capital with an A of Tartaria. And then consider that such a structure like this were possible. And if you add together structures from, say, London, St. Petersburg, Washington, D.C., and many other locations, you could very easily have a structure such as this that would function as your capital with an O. It's quite an intriguing premise, and when we think about a unified civilization where every individual worked together, and at the same time the society supported the individual, recharging their internal energy, then it seems as though the limitations are endless. We look at the current capital in the United States, and we're told that it was constructed initially and then renovated, and then a new dome was built during the United States Civil War, no less, and it still stands as a proud beacon of hope and democracy, even in the nation that labels the constitutional republic as its primary form of governance. Not that it truly matters at the end of the day, because it seems as though we say one thing and mean another, and that's always the basis of politics. But let's look at the concept of the capital city across all the lands. We have many different types of capital cities, and oftentimes we see domes, we see tall spires, and other very alluring structures. We also have fictional depictions of capital cities, science fiction and fantasy, where we hear about famous cities such as Minas Tirith in the Lord of the Rings series, and of course King's Landing in the Game of Thrones series, or A Song of Ice and Fire. These capitals represent the centers of learning and civilization. Also look at the capitals across the North American continent. By the way, special points to anybody who can identify the second one from the right and what it represents. And isn't it intriguing how it compares to the other capitals in what we consider North America? But what do you think? How do you think these capitals line up, and what do they say? Many other capitals we see immense beacons and domes and obelisks that represent different various things. Do they really reflect our current civilization, or are they merely remnants of the past that have been repurposed to give us a different impression of what these capital cities truly are? It should be noted that for our initial explorations, we've also considered state capitals in the United States. And on paper, the state within the United States is supposed to represent a nation in many respects. Although it's not a full independent nation, although they could be, and that's always the subject of legal debate as well. But we see the same principles within the capital city. We see that whether it's a state capital or a national capital, there's always the Capitol building, there's always the interesting courtyard layout or the centralized layout, and you have no shortage of very impressive monuments, oftentimes including columns and numerous pillars arrayed together in fine monuments. Also consider the opulence of the interior of many of these structures that we consider. And we haven't really started to go deep into Europe yet, but that's coming fast. And when we look at Europe, we'll see many fine examples of beautiful interiors and exteriors of great elaborate buildings within their immense and impressive national capitals. Interestingly enough, some national capitals you'll find that you don't have exactly the best images of, and you have to ask the question, why is that? Why are certain perspectives not as easy to find full definition images on? It's almost as though we're not supposed to see them. Although you'll find that if you notice them from different perspectives, or if you have the photo taken from another perspective, it's completely different. It's much easier to find a high definition image. And the only reason I'm highlighting this in this exploration is just to make you aware of it. It seems to be that whatever's available, and it could simply be circumstance and coincidence, and you know this channel's feelings about circumstance and coincidence. Why is it some buildings are easier to see from some perspectives, but we're not so encouraged to see them from other perspectives? We have many fantasy layouts, and of course we've looked at many layouts of cities that we were told were in existence during the so-called medieval period, where we saw a lot of geometrically precise foundation structures around them. Now, were these geometrically precise foundation structures part of their original design? Indeed, in King's Landing, in the fictional history of Game of Thrones, we oftentimes have a variety of historical explanations for the vast edifices, the great religious structure, and then of course the Red Keep. What's really the story behind it? Well, there's a story behind every building. And yet if you look in national capitals such as Madrid, you also have a story behind every building. And it's not just limited to places such as Madrid. You'll find it also in the great cities, the state capitals across the United States, and really every city across the land. Oddly enough, though, these great edifices and where they're constructed, along with the wonderful structures with them, you know, if this was in the United States, we know full well this would probably be some sort of Civil War monument, and they either would have had to have renamed it depending on its location, or maybe they would have designated it somewhere else and called it something else. It's always very interesting to consider. Indeed, many of the fantasy settings that we see in capitals seem to have been inspired by real-life locations and are oftentimes based on real-life locations. So it's really not as much fantasy or science fiction as we might be led to believe. Of course, naysayers will always tell us that it's all just in our imagination. And yet, many of these impressions are based on real-life structures, the exteriors and the interiors. For example, we've seen this layout of this certain interior. It's oftentimes called an arcade, and we've looked at a few arcades in the United States of all places. Shopping centers, or so we're told, and yet they display opulence and luxury and beauty. And of course, this will be explained away by being told that these were simply the indulgences of the Gilded Age. People who simply had too much money and didn't exactly know what to do with it before they became philanthropists, if you're in the United States, or oligarchs if you're not in the United States, depending on who's telling the story. However you look at it, though, you'll see that there are great and wondrous structures in many capital cities across the lands. And these capital cities reflect the centers of administration, art, and supposedly where political power of a nation is exercised. Although, is political power real, or is it more of a facade, or does it just depend where you are in the land? Well, depending on what sources you read, you'll be told all three. What I find intriguing, though, is there seems to be a template, or a pattern, if you will, that endures with capital cities across the land, regardless of whether they're national capitals, state capitals, or have any kind of designation as a capital. And where did that template originally come from, with beautiful buildings that seem to be very artistically and spiritually inspired? It seems to be clear that that original template either must have been the actual capital of Tartaria, or perhaps Tartaria was broken down into regional districts that had what Old World Exploration and myself refer to as hubs, or large areas, large cities that seem to have a specific function or administration. Let me be clear, I'm talking about large cities, not the other term that I tend to use when I'm talking about our lovely 5th era cities. So what does it come down to with this administrative function? Well, let's take a look at the example of Avalon. The story of Avalon actually comes from the Arthurian legend, or La Morte de Arthur. What exactly is Avalon supposed to be, and how could it possibly represent a concept of what the capital of Tartaria was? We're told that Avalon in the Arthurian story... No, not that Avalon. There we go. The Isle of Avalon. Once Arthur died, or rather, once Arthur was asleep, following his grievous wound in the last battle, he was taken to the Isle of Avalon to recover. Could this potentially have represented some pre-existing civilization's capital, or at least the concept of a capital? Or for that matter, could King Arthur have been a significant commander from the old civilization who was trying to restore that which was lost due to the chaos that we've speculated inflicted the previous civilization? There seem to be many different indications that that is indeed what is happening, and for a time Arthur was quite successful. Although in the end, according to the story that we understand, how it's been passed down to us, now we don't know of its veracity and we have no way to confirm it, is that Arthur was eventually undone by the very sins of his own and some of the flaws within his knights. And there's a reason why I oftentimes refer to the story of Gawain and the Green Knight. I think there's a lot of reflections in it and how humanity and how individuals have been challenged over time. There's also some sort of compelling baseline truth within the Arthurian legend. And it's not just in the Arthurian legend, it's not just in the Western cultures. You'll find it everywhere across the land. The Eastern cultures, the Middle Eastern cultures, the African cultures. There's actually a lot more similarity than we like to pretend there is. It seems to be that oftentimes, though, we're told that there are many vast differences, and yet many of the stories have many of the same aspects to them. The aspects of trust, the aspects of belief, and the aspects of individual strength. And we see that reflected in the story of King Arthur, which is one of the reasons why it's a very compelling story. It's probably also a reason why the story has been retold numerous times, and it seems to be degraded and denigrated every single time that it is retold, along with many other stories, whether it's one of our original myths or even a movie that we think may have came out in the mid to late 20th century. There's actually the aspect that Avalon might truly exist, and indeed Arthur's tomb might be a real place that we can access. And I'm not going to refer to the more well-known one, Arthur's Seat, we'll get to that in a moment, but consider that if at this great tour there could actually be a burial site for Arthur and his remnants. What happened to the rest of the knights? What was the true story behind the Arthurian legend? And I've referred to Robin of Sherwood numerous times in previous explorations, and I'm sure you probably won't be surprised to hear that there's a 3rd season episode of Robin of Sherwood called The Inheritance, which concerns Robert of Huntingdon, who has now taken the mantle of Robin of Sherwood, his attempts to help the new heir of Camelot, or at least the castle that's become Camelot in the distant future, and he has to make a difficult decision if he's going to continue to serve Herne the Hunter, or actually serve the spirit of King Arthur. These are all very intriguing aspects, and what exactly does any of this have to do with the capital of Tartaria, you're probably asking? It's in the mentality of it, it's in the spirit of it, and it's also in the concept of having a leader and individuals who assist that leader in actually taking full responsibility for the people above all. I think one of the things that we tend to see with many leaders, whether we call them president or king or queen, emperor, empress, or whatever, is that oftentimes, and our mainstream history will corroborate this, they tend to be self-serving individuals. And what we glean from Arthur and the story of the Knights of the Round Table, and even in the very concept, the Knights of the Round Table or the Knights of the Round, is that they were about serving the people and the society above all else. and yet they managed to achieve a state of balance in doing so. And that is why the story of the Arthurian legend factors into the legend of a capital. And perhaps that Avalon refers to that capital, or maybe one of the last surviving regional capitals of the previous civilization, the civilization of the Fourth Era, or the one that the channel simply labels as Tartaria. The other intriguing aspect is the internal strength that we see depicted in Arthur. And the only film that really comes close to depicting that to its full extent is Excalibur. Now, there's a scene where Arthur draws the sword from the stone, and the great knights of the land, as it's called in the film, which is where I draw that term from, resist Arthur, led by Sir Uriens, pictured here. Arthur has the chance to simply kill Uriens on the spot, but instead he shows him mercy, and even shows faith in Uriens, giving him Excalibur to knight Arthur, who had not even been knighted. It's probably one of the most powerful scenes in any film about King Arthur, and I still find it shows the true power of individual courage and spirit, but not just belief in oneself, but belief in others. And you might notice there's a commonality, a theme that comes about in our current civilization, in our societies, where we have this underlying theme that we must distrust every other individual. There's only certain institutions that we can truly trust. And indeed, the Arthurian legend ends with Arthur finding his doom at the hands of his illegitimate and sinfully conceived son, Mordred. And that's also what's depicted in the film Excalibur. And what does that really reflect overall? It reflects that oftentimes it's an internal battle that is more important than the external battle. And indeed, when we think about the layout of our capital cities, imagine what they could really reflect if people did have that sort of internal strength that you see reflected in the film Excalibur, the fellowship among the knights and how they're really working to look after one another in the society they defend. We can find many wondrous remnants of older structures all over the land that no doubt reflect the grandeur and glory of a civilization that came before ours. And it doesn't matter where you are, whether you're in the United States or New Zealand or Australia or the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Russia, Iran, Iraq, it doesn't matter. You'll find numerous examples of these structures and a previous civilization everywhere you look. Now, are there different variations on them? Yes, but are there many similarities that we see across the land? And logistical feats of unbelievable triumph that defy the ability of logic to explain. And that's what we tend to see in all of our explorations. So you look back on it and you wonder, where does magic and the concept of magic come from? Well, oddly enough, science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke posited that to a significantly advanced civilization compared to a civilization that's not advanced, their technological capability would seem like magic. What if that's really the explanation for many of these myths and legends that we have, and strange things that still seem to endure with us to this day? It's also noted that when you travel to certain lands, wherever you are, you'll notice that there seems to be a different sort of feeling depending on your exact location. Now, a lot of us might attribute this to personal experiences on these lands, but what if there's something more to this? What if there are some lands that have a mystical, spiritual energy that resonates with them to this very day? And that for this reason, that when you travel to these lands, you can feel these unique healing properties. In my own personal experiences, I've felt this in many locations, such as Ireland, and even in the Middle East, in places that people would think were beset by conflict, and yet at the same time, there was something so much more to them. You can feel that there is a rich and beautiful history that's oftentimes overlooked. And it seems to be something that we associate with our modern cities to this day. Many of these cities have a different history to them that we suspect, and they have these old world structures and these tales that will just be told are myths and legends that we should dismiss right out of hand. And there's no way that Los Angeles could have ever been a wonderful, beautiful city where every individual felt that they really contributed and they felt included within their government. But it is possible that it existed. And if we look at the origin of our cities across the lands, we see that we're oftentimes given conflicted accounts and perceptions with how we're supposed to regard cities now in the Fifth Era. But if we look back into the past, we find that's not always the case. We find that there is much more to them. We find that there is an internal strength that still endures in all of us that is reflected in these cities. And even though in the Arthurian legend there's stories of betrayal and there's stories of people succumbing to their own individual whims, it does reflect to the potential of a capital city, such as Camelot. Another example, and a very likely example of a city, a capital city, that was quite real. And we have many different descriptions of Camelot. And did it reflect a once existing Tartarian capital? Or was it in fact the Tartarian capital? And where was it possibly located? We also think of the existence of Arthur's son Mordred, and the entire concept of Arthur was that he was supposed to provide an heir to wield Excalibur and maintain balance over the land, and that's not what happened. Instead, his son represented the very base of all of his sins, and unfortunately he was forced to kill his son in order to restore balance to the land. But there's something more that's reflected in that when we think of how our current civilization constantly causes us to question ourselves and causes us to doubt what our own understanding of ourselves are. Indeed, it seems as though every single event that we encounter every day, whether it's just living our lives in our homes or going about our regular jobs, they seem to cause us to question our very place and our very role within the land. And yet we find that we have a lot more power over this than we're led to believe. If we simply step back and take a look at things and view things with new eyes and just start with looking at the once great structures of the past and how they integrated with the land, that seems to be something that was much more effective in the past. Even though we are constantly told about how our current civilization values the environment and the ecology, it seems as though we're oftentimes struggling to live in balance with it. But then we have concepts and views of buildings and structures from the past, and it seems as though those civilizations had absolutely no challenge naturally integrating and amalgamating with the natural world around them. Indeed, it's one of the facets that you see in many of the geometrically precise foundation structures or older castles, where it seems as though the very walls and the foundation is perfectly integrated within the terrain, and you see that there is a natural look to many of these, what we'd call facilities or buildings or structures, or even the old capitals, that generates a sense of spiritual well-being in every individual. And perhaps that's where the real fairy tale concept of all these castles and these older structures come from. Now, could the capital, with an O, of Tartaria have actually been some magnificent great castle, very similar to Camelot? Absolutely. But it's not just Camelot and Avalon. Oh, look, it's Sir Davos Seaworth, the early years. It's not just the concept and the capital of Avalon or Camelot, or if they were just simply myths and legends that we're interpreting as previous regional capitals of Tartaria. There seems to be some deeper concept that endures to this day. And it's also safe to say that there are many things even in our current civilization that are not as eroded or as deteriorated as we are led to believe. I personally believe that there are good concepts that survive from the previous civilization even to this day. It's just oftentimes we tend to lose sight of them. And there's a very definitive reason for that. We're oftentimes kept constantly concerned about our life's day-to-day challenges. And if you think about how a capital really functions, where everyone is working towards a unified purpose, or if you have everyone who seems to be in constant conflict, oftentimes the very nature of our politics in this fifth era, regardless of what overlapping political system we have or economic system we have, it seems as though the main goal is to pit individuals against each other. And of course you'll have numerous drama series, fictional and non-fictional, that will show the results of these struggles, and we consider them relatively entertaining, but oddly enough, the things that we find most entertaining are the ones that still weave in the messages and the values of the old world. And there's a fact in saying that, because if you look at what the most popular intellectual properties are, what's their baseline? Hint, it's not actually in the superficial aspects of it, it's truly in the old world values that it embraces. And if you watch John Boorman's 1981 film Excalibur, you'll see one of the greatest representations of the Arthurian legend, and it'll give you a good idea of what a true functioning society that was in balance looked like. And it's also stated that Arthur's seat in Edinburgh shows the remnants of what could be Camelot for all we know, or some great structure that was once the capital with an O of Tartaria, or one of the regional capitals for all we know. In different perspectives, it does have a little bit more of a structural look to it, although modern scientists will simply tell us that that's merely our imagination running away with us. And I certainly don't want to encourage your imagination to go running away that Arthur's Seat is actually a structure. There's many other questionable things in Edinburgh that we've looked at many times before. Nope. I'm not going to talk about it this time. Let's go on to Shangri-La, our last example. And here we go to the Far East, the legendary city supposedly in Tibet or the Himalayas. And does it really exist? What are the concepts behind it? There's numerous accounts of how this was also a wonderful city in a very unlikely place. There's also accounts that it's in a golden valley with wondrous architecture and a juxtaposition of cultures and civilizations. Indeed, if you've ever been to the Himalayas, you'll get that same sense to this very day. There's also a lot of interesting structural anomalies that exist in that particular area. And while you might be told and you're thinking that you're on the roof of the world, consider what the concept of Shangri-La really represents. Also consider the fact that in that particular area of the world, there's some very unique terrain. So, one of the challenges with trying to ascertain where the lost capital of Tartaria may have been located is the fact that we know there are several areas of land that clearly have been devastated. Could Shangri-La have been in one of those areas of land? The area of northeast Siberia that we've taken a look at in exploration, the Mojave Desert in the western United States, Sahara in Africa. Could the great capital of Tartaria have been located in any of these locations? Absolutely. Could it also be possible that the capital, or what remains of it, is one of the current national capitals, or even the state capitals that we have to this day? All of these things are possible, and they're very alluring at the same time, because when we visualize what Shangri-La must have looked like, and when we really think about a city such as this, and we just explored some of the very impressive structures in what we call the Far East or Southeast Asia or even the Indian subcontinent, and we see tremendous examples of advanced architectural and construction capabilities, something that we know there's no way we could construct today. In fact, even in this image in North Carolina, they have a stone structure that they refer to as Shangri-La. And what does that really reflect to us? It reflects that the words and the ideas are a lot more powerful than just simply some long-lost city from a myth or a legend. It shows how these aspects still endure with us to this day. We know that there's a deeper philosophy that's interwoven and found in the deepest subtext of our baseline religions in our society. And it does still exist even in what we believe to be the fifth era that we're currently existing in. And it's because of that that I think that the search for the actual capital of Tartaria is something that's important and valued to undertake. Now, are we actually going to find it? Do we have any guarantees that we'll find it? No, there's never any guarantees. But it's embracing our internal strength and it's reading our myth and our legends that will be able to continue the search. In the next explorations that the channel is going to be embarking on, we're going to be focused on trying to locate and get an idea of where the lost capital of Tartaria was really located, or updating our theory to include the fact that there may have been many different regional capitals. Perhaps we can finally start to get an idea of how the society of the civilization that preceded ours truly functioned. We're going to continue moving forward with our explorations. We're not going to keep going in circles. And let's remember that's something else that our current civilization, for whatever reason, tries to encourage us to do. To continue on a circle, to be stuck in an infinite recursion loop, where you're not really going anywhere, you're only just going into a little bit of depth, but at the end of the day, you're just getting a mild entertainment out of it. And it never goes any further than that. If you're prepared, you can go anywhere that you want to. And it always comes from the inside. And that's why this search for the capital of Tartaria is important. And it reflects that quest that all of us are on to truly find and understand who we are on the inside. And that's the ultimate power that we have, that no one, no institution, and no other individual can ever take from us. Well, thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this exploration. Please like, comment, and subscribe.